University of Delaware. And since this particular seminar is a project of the Popular Music Project and sponsored by the Norman Lear Center, we're going to have Josh Kuhn, who is the faculty host for David, make the introduction. Josh.
Thank you, Peter, for letting us co-present and collaborate with you. And thank you to all of you for making this an incredible turnout. I was totally paranoid that we would have 10 people on the first day of classes. No, not in person. This is really gathering, not only in the sheer numbers, but also because we've got students here, undergrads, we've got grad students, we have faculty, but I also see some brave members of the music industry in the world who have decided to leave their offices and come here and hear what David has to say, as well as some music critics, folks from journalism school. So it's a nice mix, exactly the kind of mix of an audience that we'd like to see. This is, as I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone, a very prime moment to be thinking about the past, present, and future of the music industry, an industry that is very much, what's the euphemism, in transition, and especially coming at the end of 2009, a year that increasingly saw popular music go from more conventional notions of commercial recorded music in the physical form to not just digital, but from digital stores to digital clouds, where now the question is much about the loss, let's say, of the physical object as it is the potential loss of the very idea of selling music itself. Services like Lala, services like Grooveshark, RIP, are all kind of actively trying to grapple with how to deal with the future state of recorded music. It's something that at the Popular Music Project we are also actively pursuing through research, I should say most importantly through an undergraduate research team, a workshop featuring Courtney Holt, who's the head of MySpace Music, who is responsible for the RIP of and Courtney has agreed to work with a group of Annenberg undergraduates to help him think about the future of selling and sharing recorded music. So we've got a group of undergraduate students who met with Courtney and MySpace folks last semester who are now working up their own plan of what the future should look like. And if all goes according to our plan, we will be able to showcase their presentation with MySpace Music here in this room by the end of the semester. So I'll be sure to keep everyone posted on that. A key player in my own thinking, and I know a lot of our own thinking in these issues, in seminars last semester and seminars to come, has been this wonderful new book, Selling Sounds, that our guest today wrote and published last year with Oxford University Press. It's a book that is about the early parts of the 20th century, the early parts of the music industry, but a book that still feels incredibly contemporary to me. A book that has the kind of best example of what good history does, that it makes us rethink the present moment and really think strongly about what's to come. David has also co-edited another new volume called Sound in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which is part of an exciting new branch of work being done on sound studies and sound culture that has some incredible pieces in it. So I wanted, it was really because of the meeting of his work and what's going on in the real world of music culture that I thought he'd be a great person to bring to share his ideas and kind of mull it over with all of us. So with no further ado, I'll introduce our guest today, David Suisman.
Thanks for that great introduction, Josh. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Nina, very much, so much for making all these great arrangements and stuff. It's wonderful to be here. It's really also so gratifying to see people who are here, but I also think it's not about me. I think it's about how invested everybody is in music, and in some ways that's a more general thing that I'm really interested in. Also, I should say that I'm absolutely terrified that there are so many people here who are actually in the music business. I'm a historian. I deal with dead people. And so I'm thrilled and also terrified to hear what you're going to have to say. So let me begin with recording. Let me begin with a recording. In the interest of time, I'm just going to play an excerpt from it, probably for about 10 or 15 seconds. That recording is called Silence. The complete version is 1 minute and 3 seconds long. It first appeared on the Whitey album by Ciccone Youth, an alias of the band Sonic Youth, which claimed that the cut was a tribute to John Cage's silent composition in 1952, titled 4 minutes and 33 seconds, whose score instructed a pianist to sit before a piano on stage and not play for that amount of time. Cage's well-known composition is often regarded as a revolution in 20th century music, and in many ways it was. It also had deep historical roots, however, positioning Cage as an heir to Walt Whitman, whose model of democratic listening Josh Kuhn writes about so beautifully in his book, Audiotopia. Echoing Walt Whitman, John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds appealed to audience members simply to listen to the rich world of sound in which they were already enveloped and to which they already and always belonged. The cut by Ciccone Youth, for its part, implies an additional level of hearing, asking, in effect, what are we listening to when we listen to a commercial recording? These days, however, even silence has its price. The iTunes Music Store is said to contain more than 10 million songs, and included in this vast catalog of recordings is Silence, which is available for purchase for a mere 99 cents. Because Sonic Youth has, for many years, explored the interstices between music and noise, art and kitsch, culture and commerce, it seems somewhat fitting that Silence should now be for sale online. Ciccone Youth's Silence is musical recording distilled to the form of pure commodity, an empty vessel, a parody of the music industry. Indeed, when news of this quiet commercial anomaly seeped into the mainstream media in 2004, Apple representatives reacted sheepishly and pledged to eliminate Silence as a standalone purchase. As of a few days ago, however, the last time I checked, Silence remained very much for sale. And when I bought the digital file in 2006, it came complete with anti-piracy encoding to ensure that purchasers could not copy or trade the recording in violation of applicable copyrights. Curiously, Apple's representatives said nothing about eliminating the 7 other noiseless recordings which iTunes also sold, including 3 from a hip-hop album called Trinity, Past, Present, and Future by Slum Village, which were labeled explicit, although clean versions were available for sale as well. In my book, Selling Sounds, The Commercial Revolution in American Music, I try to explain how this curious acoustic culture came into being, in which the commercial function of music had become so widespread that even silence could be sold as a consumer commodity. In the half-century from the end of Reconstruction in the 19th century to the start of the Great Depression in the 1930s, many of the foundations of our own oral world were laid in place. They were shaped by the formation of a new kind of music industry in the United States. In these years, an enormous and complex music economy took shape and set in place many of the values and assumptions that still underpin music and oral culture today. And when I say oral, throughout this talk, it's always A-U-R-A-L, of course. By the 1930s, American culture sounded different than it ever had in the 19th century, with Americans hearing more music and more kinds of music in more places than ever before. Along with this change, music came to occupy a different place in the culture, economy, and social relations of modern life, with substantial implications not just for music, but for American society as a whole. Generally speaking, history has a poor ear, but if you learn what to look for and where to look, then the oral record of the past can take shape and become evident. The formation of this new musical economy and new musical culture had numerous components and took place on several registers, each with its own historical underpinnings and developmental dynamics. And in the book, what I do is I explore these, sort of break these down. I talk about the different elements that came together, the different elements that converged to create the modern music industry and this new musical culture that we take for granted. These components included the transformation of songwriting and music publishing, centered in New York City in the industry nicknamed Tin Pan Alley. This song was, in many ways, this sheet music from this song was in many ways the first groundbreaking hit, and usually claimed to be, and I think in a lot of ways is, written by a guy named Charles K. Harris, published in 1892 and 1893. And Harris was somebody who figured out that really to create songs that were popular, that sold very, very widely, it wasn't just enough to write really good songs with clever melodies. It was also about figuring out how to market them, and he was an innovator in paying performers all across the country to sing his songs. He, what the system later called payola, was very much part of the innovation of how to make songs popular, and that meant selling widely. There were a host of other techniques as well. I talk about these extensively in the book. Some of them were economic, some of them were commercial, some of them were based on different promotional techniques and tactics. Like Tin Pan Alley sent out these song pluggers all around New York to test out how songs appealed to audiences. They sang them in all kinds of public places, on streetcars, in parks, at dances, and so on. They also sang them in vaudeville and movie houses, where they used additional visual marketing techniques, like what were called song slides. These were hand-painted glass slides that would be projected to give a visual accompaniment to the lyrics of songs. Some, three-quarters of a century, three-quarters of a century, even more, before MTV premiered and so on. The book also talks about the phonograph industry and the player piano industry, which worked together in tandem, and the development and implications of mechanical reproduction. An important part of the story, I argue, also involves the relationship between the two different formats of phonographic technology and this very early iteration of the rival formats. On the left, it was the disc format, promoted most heavily by the Victor Talking Machine Company, here embodied by Enrico Caruso, who we were listening to when you all were coming in. And on the right-hand side, it was Thomas Edison's company, called the National Phonograph Company. And I don't have time to get into all this extensively, but two things that I would point out. One is that Victor became the big winner here. Victor really remade much of the music industry on its own terms, after its own image, and it did so using a variety of techniques. And one of them was simply that it figured out how to advertise far better than any other music company ever had, and had implications far beyond the music economy. So advertising trade journals said, check out what Victor is doing in the music industry, because they are on the cutting edge of advertising. One of the ways that they did that was by promoting celebrity. They got people to buy phonographs, machines, by selling them records, by getting them interested in records. How would they get them interested in records? Well, they tried to sell them high culture. And how do they sell them high culture? Well, you give high culture a face, and that was the face right there. Thomas Edison didn't get it. Thomas Edison, who was the loser in this big story, I wish this were a slightly better reproduction, but hopefully you can kind of see, it's these old folks, and there's no caption here, but basically what they're saying is, gee, isn't that cool? And that wasn't enough to really get people excited about the phonograph. Maybe it would spark a little bit of interest, but it wasn't a way of developing a long-term culture. Anyway, there's a lot more to that, but I don't have time to sort of detail all these different elements, but it gives you a suggestion of these different components of the industry that converged. Regardless of the different components, however, all of these different components were led by people who were essentially businessmen first and music men second. And this is really one of the lasting legacies. The music industry was created in this way by people who approached what they did first and foremost as business. Some of them in Tin Pan Alley, for example, had experience as musicians, had been songwriters or whatever, but they left this behind and they focused essentially on their work as business. They also, especially in Tin Pan Alley, for example, they had experience in commerce. The leading music publishers, the publishers who remade Tin Pan Alley, were people who, before they worked in music publishing, had been salesmen. They sold one had sold corsets, one sold neckties, another one sold water filters. Regardless of what they were selling, they learned about selling. And they brought this experience to songwriting and to music publishing. And the same is true in the phonograph industry, where the leading figures, the people who were the captains of industry in phonograph, were not music men. And in fact, they were, some of them were more or less indifferent to it. They brought other kinds of expertise, and music was what they fit into their business model. Songwriters, too. Over and over again, you read how the reports of songwriters, interviews with songwriters about what they did, and they said, first thing you have to know is what you're doing as a professional songwriter is you are working in a business. They say this over and over again. Now, today, condemnations about how music has become a commodity are commonplace. So much so that they often give the impression that the intense commercialism of the music business today is a recent phenomenon. Here's one example. David Geffen, quoted in a cover story in the New York Times Magazine on Rick Rubin in 2007. David Geffen says, music business as a whole has lost its faith in content. Only 10 years ago, companies wanted to make records, presumably good records, and see if they sold. But panic has set in, and now it's no longer about making music. It's all about how to sell music. Now, such laments have a long history. Almost a century ago, in 1910, the New York Times derided the songwriting and music publishing business called Tin Pan Alley as nothing more than a group of popular song factories. And a few years later, in the pages of the leading music industry trade magazine, one of Geffen's professional forefathers, one of the leaders of the business at that time, expressed nothing but dismay for what he saw as the industry's intense commercial turn. The publishing business today, this person said in 1904, is like any other line with a variety of goods to offer. Pardon the commercial term, but it applies all the same. In contrast to the many critiques of music business commercialism today that harken back to an earlier, purer, less mercenary era, these remarks from a century ago indicate that anxiety over the so-called commercialism of music are as old as the modern music industry itself. Simply put, there was no golden age. My point is not just that it was that it was just same as it ever was today, but rather to show that this commercial music apparatus has a history, that it was not a historical given, but instead was created by specific people under specific circumstances based on particular assumptions and motivations. The implications of this are profound, suggesting the importance of historical contingency and the possibility of other musical regimes. Moreover, reflecting on the rich history of American music in the last century or so, this point forces us to think beyond a binary of commodity versus not commodity, because virtually all of 20th century music was inflected by this commodity system in either direct or indirect ways. Indeed, if all music is in some way today linked to commodity relations, then we must confront a harder question. Namely, what does it mean to produce culture in a capitalist society? It's not sufficient simply to say that music is a commodity. We must instead think about what kind of commodity is it? How did it become this way? How is it like or unlike other commodities? And what are the consequences of it being so? For the remainder of my time, I'd like to consider some of the ways that the development of the modern music industry a century ago can inform how we think about the changes taking place today. And my aim here is not to devise any way of saving the music industry in any recognizable form, but rather just to think about what the music industry does and what it tells us about cultural change. Now imagine, if you will, a situation in which music companies face a severe challenge to their business model. of selling physical objects. And they watch as unauthorized copies of their work circulate freely and widely. Imagine music companies decry the injustice of this circulation, claiming their property rights are being trespassed upon, that musicians are suffering as a result of this trespass, and that as a consequence, the health of the musical culture at large is at risk. Indeed, this scenario probably sounds familiar, because it aligns closely to the narrative associated with today's music business and the decline of CD sales over the last decade. This is not the first time that a situation like this has confronted the music industry, however. At the turn of the 20th century, popular music publishers of Tin Pan Alley faced a similar situation, precipitated by the surge in sales in phonograph records and player piano rolls. Until that time, in the early 20th century, music publishers had trafficked in physical objects in the form of sheet music or printed scores, which is to say that the works that they published were copyrighted, but there was very little effective difference between the value of the copyright and the value of the physical object. In the early 20th century, with the rise of mechanical reproduction, publishers watched as the circulation and the value of these two things, the copyright and the physical object, split apart. At that time, manufacturers of phonograph records and piano rolls were not bound to pay any royalty on mechanical reproduction of music that they issued, even if that music was copyrighted. No additional payment was warranted, they maintained, because they had already paid the publishers when they bought the sheet music. By contrast, music publishers and other large copyright holders took, not surprisingly, an opposing view, claiming that they were due rightful compensation for reproduction of their copyrighted material. With publishers and manufacturers of records and rolls at an impasse, the music publishers then waged a vigorous campaign to have U.S. copyright law overhauled in order to impose a legally mandated royalty for mechanically reproduced copies of their work. The final outcome of their effort, which was achieved only after years of agitation, was the Copyright Act of 1909, a landmark piece of legislation that established the foundation of copyright law for most of the 20th century, and whose provisions pertaining to music and mechanical reproduction still underpin many of the legal and economic issues that dominate music today. Rather than dealing the major points of the copyright law, the 1909 law, and their long-term implications, which is something I do in the book, I want to instead simply point to the 1909 law as a precedent for the way that the music industry responded to a profound and existential challenge, a challenge that was both technological and cultural, as it is today, and did so in a way that shored up the industry's already substantial assets and paved the way for long-term development and expansion. Given the ease with which people today can copy and distribute digital files, copyright reform might not be the most efficacious strategy for the industry to pursue. This is speculative, but that's sort of what I think is probably true. But the law may still be a formidable weapon for the industry. The internet is not impervious to regulation or restriction. To all the digital utopian idealists who proclaim that information wants to be free, I would offer the reminder that the internet is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. And if those who control the servers through which the internet operates wanted to restrict or shut down the flow of information and data, they certainly could. One need only look at places like China and Iran for examples of where this occurs. In the United States, staunching the flow of digital bits is unlikely to take such draconian forms, but other scenarios are possible. Yes, digital file sharing has undermined the kind of control that the industry has long sought to exert over its products, the kind of control that actually has been, goes back to the early 20th century. But the industry is far from powerless. For several years, the Recording Industry Association of America, the RIAA, was bringing lawsuits against music-loving consumers, which was a public relations disaster. But these lawsuits did stand as a salutary reminder that in what looked like a David and Goliath showdown Goliath's assets did include very deep pockets and the ability to bring complex multi-million-dollar lawsuits for copy infringement, as well as mobilizing a powerful lobbying agent in Washington. It is conceivable, for example, that rather than suing and trying to intimidate music-hoarding college students, the RIAA could secure legislation that would hold internet service providers liable for the transmission of unauthorized copyrighted material. If ISPs were legally responsible for the music files their users downloaded and exchanged, they would most certainly take steps to prevent this transmission. We're not there yet, but such an eventuality reminds us that the relatively unfiltered flow of digital information should not be taken for granted. We might do well to remember, too, that for the music industry, the core problem isn't computer technology itself, but simply the fact that computer users are tended to resist paying out of pocket for the music they wish to listen to. But other models are possible, too, such as online subscription services like Napster or Rhapsody. But what if people don't want to pay for those? Well, it's not hard to imagine a deal in which music usage fees would be passed on to consumers as a component of their internet service charges. Again, there is something like historical precedence for this in the development of, in this case, performing rights. Based on the 1909 copyright law, the Supreme Court ruled in 1917 that restaurants and other commercial institutions were bound to pay royalties on music that they played, even if customers were not coming for the music explicitly. The significance of this decision was to establish a legal foundation for the doctrine of performing rights. As a result, today, whenever you hear music in a restaurant or in a store or in a hotel, that restaurant or store or hotel is paying a licensing fee for that use. And the cost of that licensing fee is passed on invisibly to consumers. Universities like USC do that too. So when the marching band at the football game plays "We Will Rock You" by Queen, or whatever it is that they play these days, because I don't really know, the university has already paid a blanket licensing fee for the use of that material. Although they don't know it, the cost of this licensing fee is passed on to tuition-paying parents or ticket-buying football fans, or however the university decides to cover that expense. Whether or not the music industry could achieve a comparable arrangement with ISPs is open to debate, but my point is that the music business has faced some comparable challenges in its formative years and might well succeed in devising viable new ways to make music pay. Who knows? We don't know. It's very unclear. But what does seem clear is that the largest music companies have still not figured out how to move forward. And I'll offer just one example. In late 2008, reports emerged that the Warner Music Group was developing a new online music service called Chorus, which would allow college students to download an unlimited amount of music from major and independent labels, all without any digital rights management. The details about how the service would work and what it would cost changed over the course of 2009, however. At first, it was suggested that participating labels would sign a covenant that they would not sue any of the users for illegal downloading on participating campuses. This feature was later dropped. It was also suggested earlier that universities would sign a blanket license, which would cover all students. This idea was later replaced with a more conventional approach of granting licenses on an individual student-by-student basis. Indeed, the only thing that seems well established about the new business model is that it's a very sensitive subject. Warner Music's new service has no informational website, no brochure, and almost nothing in writing to describe it. The Chronicle of Higher Education reported in November, however, that under a blanket of secrecy, 6 colleges and universities have been testing the experimental service and are preparing to have it up and running on their campuses this month. January. Only one Warner Music official has spoken publicly about the initiative, and the participating schools have refused to be identified. Officials from Cornell, Penn State, Illinois State, and the University of Chicago have all denied reports that their schools were among the participants. Now, in speaking of a viable new business model, what are we really talking about, though? Well, to answer this, we must recognize that the aim of the modern music industry as a whole has been, from its beginning, to make money, not to make music. And I say this not in a judgmental way, but simply as a statement of fact based on my research into how the industry took shape. People who are committed to music for music's sake may distinguish themselves, and have distinguished themselves, as valuable hands in the industry's operations, but they are not its heads. To the major recording companies, which dictate many of the terms for how the industry as a whole functions, it matters not at all what kind of music they traffic in, or in what quantities, so long as it is profitable. Genre, format, and even medium are incidental. So according to the logic of the industry, a viable new business model simply means reconfiguring the industry to return to the previous levels of profitability. And one way this may be attained is by recalibrating the importance of various different revenue streams. Once again, the longer historical perspective can be helpful. 100 years ago, Tin Pan Alley publishers discovered that there was a great deal of money to be made in supplying background music in vaudeville, for vaudeville shows and various other forms of incidental musical accompaniment. In my book, I argue that the new musical culture in the United States in the early 20th century grew not just out of the increased purchase of sheet music and records and piano rolls by consumers, but also through the expansion of an indirect musical economy in which music was used in restaurants, stores, and other spaces to enhance these institutions' commercial aims, and thereby really transforming the whole soundscape of consumer capitalism. To put this in the language of today's music industry, the industry has depended for more than a century not just on business-to-consumer sales, known as B2C, but also on the business-to-business revenue stream, or B2B. The advent of the internet has had little adverse effect on the B2B market, and the B2B market may well play a growing role in the industry's future. Thus, if one revenue stream contracts, such as the sale of CDs or any other kind of physical units, then the industry may find hope in another revenue stream's expansion. And in fact, there is evidence that to some degree this is already happening. In a 2009 report prepared for the Performing Rights Society, which is the UK's equivalent of ASCAP, bucks the conventional wisdom about the declining music industry and asserts that the music economy in the UK grew by 4.7% from 2007 to 2008. The business-to-consumer stream may be increasingly precarious, the authors of this report found, but the various forms of B2B revenue grew a combined 10% over the previous year and now accounted for more than a quarter of the industry's overall revenue. Now, I haven't been able to find a comparable report for the United States, but it seems to me likely that many of the same trends apply here as well. In essence, what I've tried to show in my book is that the emergence of the modern music business had implications not just for itself or for music, but for American culture at large. And the formation of the new music industry, I argue, helped produce a new cultural sensibility, what Raymond Williams would call a structure of feeling. As in every historical moment, this structure of feeling contained within it a range of residual, dominant, and emergent impulses, interlocked in a complex set of hierarchical relations. The residual elements were the holdovers, the older strains that people deliberately or unconsciously remained attached to. The dominant strains, not surprisingly, were those that defined the prevailing structures, practices, values, and assumptions. And the emergent strains were the incipient newer forms, sometimes oppositional, sometimes not, which were then coming into being. Given these dynamic relations and competing impulses, the dominant forms and ideas of the new musical order were never absolute, all-encompassing, or stable. They did, however, establish the definitive character of the new musical culture, and transform people's horizon of expectations. In some ways, this transformation empowered consumers, bringing more music into their lives, giving them a vastly expanded range of choices, and making it possible for them to hear many kinds of music to which they otherwise would not have had any access. Beyond and behind consumers, however, the primary authority over music lay with the industry, for whom commercial values preceded aesthetic values, in whose interest it was to avoid challenges, aesthetic, political, whatever, to the prevailing social order, and whose growing dominance made alternative models of cultural production increasingly scarce. Now, with that said, old models of music making don't disappear quickly, easily, or perhaps ever completely. For example, much has been made of the decline in CD sales and the rise of P2P file sharing, BitTorrent clients, MP3 blogs, and so on. But these issues alone may give a distorted picture of what's really happening in the world, suggesting only that people who once may have been buying CDs in stores are now all sitting at their computers uploading and downloading all day. A glance at the sales data for musical instruments tells a different story. As the historian and musicologist Carl Hagstrom Miller has noted, while CD sales have been tanking and downloads soaring, people have also been buying more and more musical instruments. And I want to pause and go through. I'll just show you some. I have some data from the National Association of Music Manufacturers, and I'll just sort of go through it kind of quickly. These are showing 10 years of growth, and there's a little dip, and it only goes up through 2006, so I can't say what happened in the last couple of years. I didn't pay the $125 for the updated report. But both acoustic and electric guitars, sales have increased. Total guitars, these graphs show both units and dollar amounts. I'm happy to go back and talk about these later during discussion if people are interested. Sales of printed music have increased, and this is pretty astonishing. Printed music has increased some 34% over 10 years, and this growth comes despite the proliferation of websites like frettofret.com and ultimateguitar.com, which offer free guitar tablature. So the alternative to printed music for free online is pretty widely available, and those sites, as I'm sure people know, are quite widely used. What else do I have here? Music sales per capita this is instrument sales, increased 14.7% over 10 years. Export units, this makes the data a little more complicated, so I'll skip over it so we don't have to screw up my nice clean argument. And industry totals, over 10 years worth of growth. And the one thing I would just sort of stress that really highlights this point even more is that this data does not show secondhand sales. Anybody who knows anything about music knows that secondhand market for instrument sales is and always has been a huge part of that market. So these numbers would probably be even greater. Now, if a correlation really exists, as I have suggested, between the decline of CD sales in the last 10 years and the increase in music instrument sales, then it may be possible to argue that what has been bad for the recording business is good for musical culture at large. These preliminary data are probably insufficient to support such an argument, but again, some historical perspective may be instructive. 100 years ago, critics and skeptics warned that the rise of mechanical reproduction would displace traditional musical training and practice, which had grown dramatically in the 19th century. But the skill and will to play musical instruments did not atrophy and disappear, despite the proliferation of phonograph records and piano rolls. In my book, I argue that many forms of musical practice came to follow the models and priorities of the music industry. But the record industry's imposing consumption-based prerogatives did not eradicate popular music making completely. The modern music industry may have cultivated a new dominant musical culture, but residual and emergent forces have never been absent. In 2009, which was the 10th anniversary of the launch of Napster, popular news reports underscored how much had changed over the last decade. To many industry watchers, the most revealing story of the year was the closing of the Virgin megastores, those phantasmagoric emporia of store-bought entertainment. To my mind, though, an equally telling story was one that appeared in the Buffalo News in January 2009, announcing that after more than a century, that QRS Music Technologies was ceasing production of player piano rolls. After 108 years of business, the last remaining producer of piano rolls in the world was shuttering its doors. Although the article framed the closure of the factory as one of those another victim of the recession stories, and it was, the underlying significance of the article, in my mind anyway, was to call attention to the fact that a company that made player piano rolls was still operating at the end of the first decade of the 21st century. Some 85 years since the player piano's heyday in the mid-1920s, here was a company whose operations and equipment dated, same machines, and equipment dated from the dawn of the modern music industry. A company that had withstood a century's worth of musical shocks, cultural eruptions, and economic fluctuations. By rights, it should have long since disappeared. If the closing of the Virgin megastores symbolizes how much musical commerce had changed in the last decade, the passing of QRS reminds us that culture may change, indeed it may change radically, but it never turns on a dime. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We've got some time for some conversation and questions. You're up for it?
I'm up for it.
Anybody have questions? Observations?
If you see any parallels to the growth of the film industry, the way you described the growth of the music industry being stock-driven and driven by commerce more than aesthetics, it seems to parallel the growth of the film industry.
Very much. There are a lot of parallels, and there are also a number of important intersections. One of the things that I tried to show in my book was, in some ways, the music industry actually preceded the film industry in some respects, for example, its focus on the star system, the cultivation of a kind of star system. This was something that the music industry devised in the first decade of the 20th century, when the film industry was still kind of downplaying who its actors were, because studios didn't like to emphasize, studios like to emphasize what the studio was and not the actors, in order not to give them too much bargaining power. There's a similar amount, there's a similar story of consolidation. There's an intersection that takes place in the late 1920s and 30s with the emergence of sound film, when the Hollywood studios thought, well, now we have the sound technology, how are we going to exploit it? The best way to exploit sound technology was through song, of course, and the surge in musicals was made possible by Hollywood by buying out wholesale all of the, not all, most of the Tin Pan Alley music publishers, to the point that the film studios became the major copyright owners in ASCAP by the 1930s. So there are both parallels and intersections, and I could talk more about these too, but one of the things that's interesting about writing this kind of history and thinking about this history is the extent to which they have so rarely been integrated, and how these stories have a lot of bearing on each other, but usually they sort of remain at a distance for each other. I just say one more thing quickly, is that, and if you look at the sort of personal level, there's an interesting story too about the difference in the background of the personalities, or the biographies of the personnel of Tin Pan Alley versus the personnel of the film studios. The film studios were these Jewish immigrants who were very unhappy, who grew up from very unhappy homes, and they in contrast to the relatively stable Jewish background of the middle-class German immigrant, Jewish German Tin Pan Alley folks. So there are a number of levels in which these comparisons can be really instructive.
So you showed that photo of the greatest music factory in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's of Camden, New Jersey.
Camden, yes.
And I grew up about 10 minutes from Camden, New Jersey, and that's not what Camden, New Jersey looks like. You talk a lot about kind of the role of these places like Camden and Orange, New Jersey, where Edison was, and Tin Pan Alley. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about kind of the role of place in all of this, and how the loss of that industry impacted those places, and what you see of the role of kind of places in the contemporary music landscape as things are so kind of spread out digitally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great question. So interesting. The issue of place really gets increasingly strained, I think, as the industry grows, because in some ways the industry, as other industries do, it developed with very deep roots in place. Victor is established in Camden because Eldridge Johnson, the founder of Victor, grew up in Dover, Delaware, and migrated to Philadelphia. So there's a small, very specific biographical story that in which you can sort of see this development. He's a machinist. Philadelphia was an industrial city in which a machinist might have opportunities both for an apprenticeship and for raising capital. So there's an important aspect of that. But one of the things that happens is that this issue of place gets strained as the industry grows and becomes national and international. These issues become less and less important in some respects as corporate capital becomes more mobile. So one of the things that Victor really did very well was establish national industries and national markets and international markets. It did things like coordinated distribution to all of its retail outlets on the same day. It would make sure that its shipments arrived at all of the different places around the country on the same day in order to create a sort of unified national market. And would punish dealers for deviating from any kind of national standard. There's an international component of this as well. And as the company grew, however, this connection to place became less and less important in a way. And a really interesting book on this is Jefferson Cowie's book on RCA called Capital Moves, which traces, and he sort of takes RCA as an example of any corporation that basically relocates its manufacturing operations to cheaper and cheaper places. And that becomes possible because what you need in a certain place, the things that connect you to a certain place are relatively limited, like a recording studio. And that's nothing like the complex operations that you as a Camden, or somebody who lived near Camden, it's huge and incredibly complicated. So hopefully that speaks to that a little bit.
I have a question for you. One of the things we talk about a lot, and particularly with my students, is not just the way that the industry is shifting, but also the way that these shifts in the industry are impacting the very notion of ownership itself. So that students are, like myself, grappling with this idea of what it means to own music anymore.
Yeah.
If ownership may not mean the same thing. And what always comes up in the conversations is the question of the jukebox. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, in your research, if you learned anything, or if there's anything instructive about the role that the jukebox has played and how we might think of, now streaming music as a kind of virtual version of a jukebox.
Mm-hmm. The jukebox emerges at a time. It is an instructive example because the jukebox emerges in the 1930s when when retail sales for regular records completely was destroyed, not only by the Depression, but also by the rise of radio. Radio was, of course, free, and jukeboxes were much cheaper than buying new records. And the jukebox survives, the jukebox thrives because it does appeal to this much simpler connection to music, which is that people didn't, in some cases people did want to own music, in some cases they're indifferent to it. In some cases people just want to hear music. which also speaks to the success of radio in general in a lot of ways. And this is a point that has always been difficult for the music industry, for the recording companies to deal with. So back in the 1909 copyright law, one of the exceptions for there were certain exceptions for an obligation to pay performing rights, and one of them was, I think if I'm remembering this correctly, had to do with jukeboxes. That there were issues that were sort of contested about the public performance of recorded music. In the same way, in some ways, that book publishing objects to libraries. The libraries have a contrary, in some ways, a contrary goal to what book publishers try to achieve. And there's a long history to this fight, and Victor tried to wage for a while by printing on the side of its labels. On the side of the labels, the records came in, a notice that said that consumers weren't actually buying the records; they were only licensing them. And they sort of wanted to. There was a whole legal underpinning for this. The Supreme Court eventually shot this down. But as far as what jukeboxes do, they really highlight this this tension. And the other thing that jukeboxes really did, in a way that the music industry couldn't do in the 1930s and still struggles to do incredibly, and this would be such an interesting parallel today, is that jukeboxes show what people really want to listen to. Jukebox operators became successful in the 1930s. They sort of entered they established a certain identity in the music industry because jukebox operators, the people who stocked the records in the machines, could go around to bars and talk to bartenders and see what people were actually listening to. And then they developed this little device that went on the jukebox that registered plays. And it was only at this level that, and through the reports based on this kind of data, that record industries, that the record companies were able to find out what it was that people cared about opposed to what they thought people cared about. And the surge in R&B and country and western recording in the 1950s in some ways came about because the record companies had learned from jukebox operators that that stuff was actually really popular. It wasn't this sort of unwanted kind of genre that the people in this sort of head office speculated about.
Mark,
I was just
Yeah.
a bit of a follow-up.
Yeah.
Terrestrial radio, what do you think the future holds?
I'm actually deeply invested in terrestrial radio, not financially, but emotionally. It's complicated. I think there is still a place for it. I think the fact that it's inexpensive, the fact that it is very stable, still has a lot of value. Cars still work pretty well for terrestrial radio, and I haven't seen any examples yet of where the satellite radio for cars doesn't really seem to be cutting into that yet. The advantage of terrestrial radio, and especially low-powered FM, is really one of the advantages. Now, low-powered FM, you could say, small stations that create community-level broadcasting or real-time broadcasting by real people is something that terrestrial radio offers very well in a zone that is somewhere between big radio, which could be terrestrial radio or could be satellite radio, and radio streams or people who are becoming broadcasters at home. Those streams, some of them are successful, but they're so decentralized, and most of them tend to be very small scale. So I think that the greatest stability or the greatest value may be in maintaining sort of low-powered FM community organizations, community institutions, which is and really what I'm saying is that actual radio technology, transmitting through radio waves to something, an antenna, a receiver that picks up, I don't actually see why that has any permanent advantage over any kind of a digital transmission or computer transmission. If we had cars that could connect easily to the internet, I think that would displace a great deal of the large metropolitan area radio stations.
They just showed them at the Consumer Electronics Show.
Did they?
Time for one more question.
It sounded like some of the early examples were moments of almost activist judges getting very involved with the particulars of an industry that enabled specific business models to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder when Victor and other companies went international, they encountered different judicial philosophies and regimes that made them have to alter their business models when to penetrate those types of markets.
It's a great question, and I don't know as much about this as I'd like because, well, I had to sort of limit the amount of I thought I was going to write there was a time when I thought I was going to do a lot more transnational stuff in the book, and I sort of touch on it, but I don't talk about it as much as I would like. The one way of thinking about that, I think maybe the most useful way of thinking about it, there is commercial law, international commercial law, that they did run into in different places. And there were some issues, and in some cases it depended on whether or not there was an actual subsidiary set up, or whether or not they were just distributors, or whether or not there were pressing plants or recording plants. And there's a fair amount of flexibility that the company could maintain. But one of the ways that this didn't come up as much as I thought was in the relative harmony of copyright law. And the international coordination of copyright law, particularly among developed nations, really gels by starting in the 1880s. And the United States is a little bit of a laggard, in fact, but gets on board, especially when it develops a certain critical mass of copyrightable, valuable copyrighted material. And if you look at the copyright histories of the developed industrial nations, they all sort of follow a pretty similar pattern. And they all sort of saw an individual interest in recognizing international copyrights. And that was really the main thing, I think, in making possible these sort of international connections. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it there.
David, thank you very much for your talk.